Elena wiped her hand on her jeans and tried again, harder this time. The old brass lock groaned in protest. The pad stuck for a second, then snapped with a metallic gasp that echoed down the corridor of the warehouse. She pushed the heavy door open, and dust lifted like spirits disturbed. The air smelled of turpentine, age, and forgotten colors. Sunlight streamed in through high windows, catching the floating particles. The studio had been closed for 6 years. Ever since her grandfather passed, it had waited untouched even by memory. Elena had never stepped inside. She hadn't painted. She hadn't even tried. The room was enormous. Wooden easels stood like silent soldiers, their spines warped with time. Canvases leaned against the walls, half covered with sheets, half finished or never begun. A thick drop cloth stretched over a workbench, and jars of brushes stood stiff with dried pigment. But the light, God, the light, poured in like gold. It was how her grandfather always described it when he spoke of this place. "It's the light that does the painting," he used to say, his hands trembling more with each year. Elena walked slowly, her boots creaking on the dusty floorboards. Her fingers trailed the edge of a canvas, paused at a smudge of crimson. She didn't know what she expected to feel. Connection? Guilt? Inspiration? She felt nothing. Near the corner stood a metal shelf slightly bent. On it, one can of paint stood alone, no label, just a pale green smear across its side. Something about it made her stop. It hadn't rusted like the others, the lid wasn't sealed shut, and for a second, just a flicker, she thought she saw the faint outline of a fingerprint in the dust on its rim. She reached for it, then froze. There was something under it, wedged between the paint can and the warped shelf. A folded piece of paper, thin and yellowed. She slid it out, careful not to tear it. It wasn't addressed to her. The handwriting was bold but careful, as if it had been written by someone holding their breath. "If you're reading this, I didn't mean for you to, but I hope you do." She stared at the words. The handwriting was her grandfather's. No doubt. The loops in the G's, the way the E's barely closed, she knew them from birthday cards, from notes on the fridge when she was a kid. But the letter continued in a way that felt like intrusion. "I never had the courage to tell her. I painted it instead. I put everything into that last canvas, but I couldn't watch her see it. I left the brush wet. I hope she forgives me." Her hand trembled. Who was this for? Not her. That was clear. But then why did he leave it here, under a paint can, in a studio she'd never wanted? Behind her, a creak. She spun. Nothing. Only the silence of wood expanding in sunlight, and a place where every inch had once meant something. Elena folded the letter and held it tight. For the first time in years, she looked at the wall of blank canvases, not as burdens, but as questions. And the paint can? She took it to the workbench, opened it, and dipped her finger in. Still wet. Still waiting. The next morning, Elena returned to the studio with a thermos of coffee and a mind full of unfinished sentences. The letter burned in her pocket. though she hadn't reread it. Not yet. Instead, she brought a notebook empty and placed it beside the paint can like a peace offering. She stood in the center of the studio, turning slowly. Something had shifted overnight. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was the light again, softer now in morning tones, scattering across the canvases like a whisper. The space didn't feel like it was waiting anymore. It felt like it was watching. She brushed off a stool and sat. Across from her, a large covered canvas leaned against the wall. It hadn't been visible before, blocked by a wheeled shelf she hadn't moved. Something about it drew her in. The cloth was heavier than the others, thick, stained at the corner. She hesitated. Footsteps. Elena startled and looked toward the door. She hadn't locked it. A man appeared, maybe in his late 30s, carrying a roll of fabric under one arm and a puzzled smile. Hi. You're not him." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He stepped in, brushing dust off his jacket. "I was told Victor's studio was closed. I used to deliver canvas here years ago. Thought I'd check if the rumor was true." Elena stood, cautious. "He passed away. I'm his granddaughter." The man's expression softened. "I'm sorry. He was a hell of a painter. Quiet, but always had jazz playing. Miles Davis, right?" She nodded slowly, taken off guard by how specific the memory sounded. "I'm Leo," he said. "Didn't mean to intrude, just saw the door open." "It's okay," she said. Then, without thinking, "Did you know anyone he painted toward the end?" Leo shrugged. "I didn't see his work much. He kept most of it covered, but there was someone who came around. Red coat. Always left before I arrived. Red coat." Elena's breath caught. She turned toward the covered canvas without explaining. Something urgent pressed at her ribs. She reached for the cloth. Leo didn't stop her. She pulled the cover back. A woman, painted in soft oils, sitting with her back partially turned, shoulders bare, her fingers playing with the edge of a red scarf. Her hair, silver blonde, was caught mid-motion, but the eyes, barely seen in profile, shimmered like glass. There was love in every inch of it. Not the kind that declared itself, the kind that endured in silence. "That's her," Leo said quietly. "I never saw her face until now." Elena couldn't speak. She stepped closer. The brushwork around the shoulder was lighter, deliberate, and there, at the base of her neck, a single fingerprint in green paint. Same as the can. She turned sharply. Why was this hidden? Leo looked at the floor. "Some people paint not to be seen, but to say goodbye." She let the silence breathe. Then, "Do you know her name?" "No, but she always brought a yellow notebook, like she was waiting." Elena swallowed hard. She walked back to her stool and sat, the letter now burning in her hand again. Everything she thought she knew about her grandfather, the quiet, the withdrawal, the silence, it was now a palette with missing colors. She looked back at the portrait and noticed something else. On the shelf near it, not where the brushes, were a second folded note half tucked into a sketch pad. Not addressed to her, but left in plain view. "I wanted to tell you, but I painted it instead. If you find this, you were always more than just the muse." Elena reached for it with a reverence she didn't understand yet. The studio had just begun speaking, and she wasn't sure whose voice would come next. The next morning, the studio felt colder, though the sun had pushed its way through the high skylight. Elena wrapped herself in one of her grandfather's old cardigans, hanging like a hug from another life, and began unpacking the dusty boxes stacked along the eastern wall. Behind them, tucked between two crooked floorboards, she spotted the corner of something yellow. She crouched down, fingers trembling, and pulled it free. A notebook, cloth-bound, yellowing with age. On the front, in delicate handwriting, were 3 words in blue ink: "For the truth." Her heart thudded. She opened it gently. Inside, page after page of sketches, some crude, others heartbreakingly precise. But no names, just dates, locations, expressions, women's faces, dozens of them, all different, all unfinished. And on the very last page, a letter. She read it aloud, softly, to the empty studio. "If you're reading this, then I didn't get to explain it all. Not to her, not to you, not to the daughter I never saw grow up. I was never brave enough. I painted her mother over and over, hoping somehow the strokes would say what I couldn't." Elena's fingers gripped the edge of the page. A daughter? She flipped back, scanning the sketches, her eyes landing on one that stopped her breath. A woman looking away, but the hair, the curve of her jaw, it was almost like looking in a mirror. No name, no title, just a date, 29 years ago. She stood, breath short, pacing the small room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. A storm was coming, but inside, another storm was already here. Elena opened the old drawer under the desk. Brushes, tubes of oil, a dried bouquet of lavender tied with twine, and beneath it, a torn envelope addressed to someone named M. Just the letter M. The handwriting matched the one on the notebook. Her grandfather had written it, but not to her. She sat back down, the floor creaking beneath her. She needed answers, and the only place to find them was in the paintings he never finished. The ones he left for someone else. Someone he never had the courage to find. The next day, the bell above the studio door jingled unexpectedly. Elena turned from the canvas she hadn't dared touch yet, startled. A man stood in the doorway, dripping from the rain, holding a cello case. He was in his 60s, with a long gray coat and kind, tired eyes. He looked as if he had walked too far, carrying too much for too long. "I'm sorry," he said, voice soft, uncertain. Was this Arturo Levi's studio?" Elena nodded slowly, still gripping the rag in her hand. "I knew him a long time ago," the man continued, stepping in and closing the door behind him. "He painted someone for me once. Someone I never saw again." Elena's breath caught. She motioned for him to sit, and the man lowered the cello case gently against the wall before settling into the old velvet chair. "She played here once," he said. "Your grandfather didn't paint her as much as capture her sound. I never understood how he did it. I loved her, but she left. She was afraid of something, maybe of staying. Elena sat across from him, the letter in the notebook still vivid in her thoughts. "Do you know who M is?" she asked. The man looked down, pressing his fingers together. Maria. That was her name. He paused, eyes distant. She was everything for a short time, and then gone. A silence passed between them like a slow-moving fog. She was pregnant, he added quietly. Arturo told me. I think that's why she left. She never wanted to trap anyone. The pieces began to shift inside Elena, not fall into place, just shift, tremble. "Do you know where she went?" she whispered. He shook his head, only that he kept painting her over and over, as if he could bring her back. She stood, walked to the canvas by the window, and pulled off the covering. A half-finished portrait of a woman with deep-set eyes and a defiant mouth stared back at her. "I think he wanted me to finish it," she said, not entirely sure why. Her hands ached with the impulse to paint, even though she'd never held a brush like that before. The man rose, picked up the cello case, and offered her a sad smile. "If you ever find her," he said, "tell her I remembered the song." He left, and the studio seemed to hum with silence. Elena looked at the canvas, then at the yellow notebook, then at her own reflection in the window. And for the first time she reached for the brush. Elena sat before the canvas long after the man had gone. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained bruised with cloud, casting a silver light through the tall window. Her hand hovered over the paints like a tuning fork over silence. She found the can again, the one marked April. She shook it gently. It wasn't dry. She pried it open. Inside, the color was strange, not quite purple, not quite gray, like a bruise healing. She dipped the brush, hesitated, then laid the first stroke across the unfinished canvas. It was clumsy, uneven, but honest. The paint bled into the woman's shoulder in the portrait, softening the sharp line her grandfather had left incomplete. Elena stepped back, heart hammering. Something trembled in the brush. It wasn't technique. It was memory, borrowed or otherwise. The knock came just as she set the brush down. A girl stood in the doorway, maybe 20, no umbrella, soaked to the skin. She wore a green coat, too thin for the weather, and clutched a rolled canvas to her chest. "Is this the studio?" she asked. I was told someone here might be able to look at my work." Elena blinked. "Who told you that?" The girl hesitated. "A man in a coat with a cello. He said to find the woman who paints sound." Elena swallowed. She motioned her in. The girl unrolled the canvas. It was raw, messy, wild with motion. Nothing like what Elena had seen before, and yet something in it sang. "I don't know what I'm doing," the girl said quickly. "I never went to school. I just paint when I can." Elena didn't respond at first. She looked around the studio, the notebooks, the jars, the unfinished portrait. "Neither did I," she said softly. The girl smiled, uncertain. "You can paint here if you want," Elena added. "I don't know if I can teach you, but The space is yours, too." The girl's eyes welled with gratitude, but she nodded briskly, pretending not to notice her own tears. As Elena cleared a corner of the room for her, she felt something shift again. Not closure, not understanding, but the beginning of a bridge. She looked up at the portrait one more time. The shoulder was still damp, shining faintly. She didn't know who the woman in the painting truly was. But somehow, painting her meant finding them all. The storm returned that night harder than before. Rain lashed against the tall studio windows, and wind rattled the frames as if something outside wanted in. Elena stayed late, curled in her grandfather's armchair with a blanket and a cup of untouched tea. The girl, her name was Maris, had fallen asleep against a wall, surrounded by her open sketchbooks. The room smelled like turpentine and wet wool. Elena couldn't sleep. She kept looking at the painting. The portrait had changed again, not physically, but in presence. The woman's eyes, once lost in a distant gaze, now seemed to be watching the room, not judging, not kind, just there. Elena shivered and stood. She walked to the back corner where the oldest supplies were stacked. She hadn't sorted through them yet. Her fingers ran across a dusty cloth, and beneath it, a frame, heavy, covered in thick black paint, like it had been sealed with anger. When she turned it over, she froze. A different portrait. The same woman. But this time she was crying. Tears painted in oil, textured so thick Elena could feel them. A folded paper was tucked behind the canvas. Elena didn't want to touch it. Her fingers trembled, but she unfolded it anyway. It wasn't addressed to her. Again. But it was written in her grandfather's slanted, hurried hand. "You said I painted her wrong, that she wasn't that still, that she laughed. I didn't want to remember that part. I was angry when she left. But you were right. I painted her like a ghost and forgot that she was fire." The paper shook in her hands. The painting stared back, blurred in the light from the bare bulb. Had her grandfather loved this woman? Had he lost her? Was she her grandmother? But no, Elena had never known her grandmother. The family never spoke of her, just that she went away young. Maris stirred and opened her eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked sleepily. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The rain kept hammering the windows. Somewhere inside her chest, something had cracked open. And through it, something else was seeping in, not just questions, but a memory that wasn't hers. Morning brought silence, not peace, just a lull, like the storm had stepped aside to let something else happen. Elena waited for Maris to wake before returning to the back corner of the studio. The canvas with the crying woman now leaned on the workbench, half covered in a painter's cloth. It didn't feel like it belonged in the open. Maris stood beside her, arms crossed, still wrapped in the oversized denim shirt Elena had found for her. "She looks real," Maris whispered. Elena nodded. "She was real," she said, "but I don't know who she is." Together, they turned the painting around again. Maris tilted her head, stepped closer, and ran a fingertip gently across the edge of the wooden frame. "There's something here," she said. Elena leaned in. Beneath the dark varnish, almost invisible under years of grime, was a mark. No, a signature. Elena grabbed a clean cloth, dipped it in solvent, and began wiping gently. Slowly a name emerged, shaky but familiar. Isabel Reyes. Not her grandfather's name. Someone else. A name she had never heard in her family. "Wait," Maris said. "That's the same signature that's on one of the sketchbooks I found. I thought it was just another artist who used to be here." She rushed to the pile, rummaged for a moment, and held up a weathered book. Inside, delicate pencil sketches of the same woman filled the pages. Not sad, not crying, laughing, spinning in a hallway, playing with a child who looked like Elena, only younger. The pages trembled in her hand. "She wasn't painted by him," Elena whispered. Maris frowned. "You mean—" "He didn't paint her," Elena said. "She painted herself." The truth hit like a dropped frame. Her grandfather hadn't created this portrait in grief. He had hidden it, covered it. Someone else had done the painting. Someone who had been silenced. The crying woman wasn't just a memory. She was a message. Elena turned slowly, looking at the studio as if seeing it for the first time. Not just a space to inherit. Not just brushes and walls. But layers. A legacy that wasn't his. And maybe wasn't even meant for Ellen. But it was here now. And it was waiting. That afternoon the rain stopped. A golden haze filtered through the skylight, softening the paint-stained shadows of the studio. Elena stood at the center, the sketchbook in her hands, the name Isabel Reyes echoing in her head like an old melody she almost recognized. She flipped to the back cover. Tucked inside was a photo, sepia-toned, frayed at the edges. A young woman stood beside her grandfather. He was younger, too, laughing, holding a brush like a sword. The woman beside him, slim, hair tied back with a scarf, eyes glinting, was the same woman from the painting. Isabel. And she wasn't crying. She was radiant. Elena pressed the photo to her chest. Something inside her cracked, not with sadness, but with a jolt of recognition. This woman had mattered. She had created something, and then been buried beneath someone else's name. Why? Maris sat on the windowsill, watching her. "You think she was his student?" she asked softly. "No," Elena said. "She was more than that." She took the photo to the neighbor, Lyle, the old man with the gray ponytail who'd brought over tomatoes and rumors. When he saw the image, his breath hitched. "God," he murmured, "that's Isabel. She used to be here every day back when he first opened this place." "You knew her?" "I knew of her," he said. "She had fire. Wouldn't take orders from anyone. They painted side by side. People thought she was going to outshine him. Then one day, she was gone." "Gone?" Elena asked. "No warning, no note, just gone." He studied the photo again. "Funny thing is, the next painting he finished after she left, it won a state grant. Got him into all those exhibitions." Elena's mouth went dry. "Which painting?" she asked. Lyle looked up. "That one with the cracked varnish. The woman with the tear. A long silence fell between them. Back in the studio, Elena pulled out that canvas once more. He hadn't just buried Isabel's painting. He had taken it, signed it as his own. Maris whispered, "What are you going to do?" Elena's voice was steady. "I'm going to give her name back." Then she reached for the paintbrush, not to paint, but to uncover, layer by layer, gently removing the name that didn't belong, letting the original signature come through. The studio, for the first time, felt still. Not dead, just listening, as if the truth had finally found room to breathe. The sun rose pale and quiet the next morning. Elena hadn't slept. A thermos of coffee sat untouched on the window ledge. Steam long vanished. She stood barefoot before the painting, now signed with a name not her own. Isabel Reyes. It was shaky, scratched from beneath years of denial, but it was hers. Elena had found it hidden under the varnish, just faint enough to survive the theft. She had finished the work her grandfather never had the courage to do. But now came the part that scared her more than scraping away old lies. Yeah, telling the world. She walked to the back wall of the studio and flipped the breaker. For the first time in over a decade, the track lights flicked on. Their glow spread across the dusty floor, illuminating forgotten corners, cobwebs above the easel, shadows of old intentions. Then she unwrapped every painting still stacked under tarps. She wiped the frames clean. She grouped them not by color or subject, but by truth. His. Hers. The untold in-between. Later, Elena brought the photo of Isabel to the local art co-op, where a woman named Clea managed a tiny gallery. Clea stared at the image for a long time, then at the cracked painting Elena brought, wrapped in cloth. "That signature," Clea said. "It's not his?" "It was hers all along," Elena said. "He just took the brush last." Clea didn't ask how Elena knew. She just nodded, like she understood something bigger than fact. "I'll give her a wall," Clea said, "but you'll have to tell the story." Elena hesitated. "What if people think I'm inventing things?" "Then let them come see the truth," Clea said. "It's dry now, but it's still loud." By week's end, the gallery had cleared a space for an exhibit titled Isabel, Reclaimed. There were only 4 pieces, one with a smudge of crimson over the horizon, another showing half a woman's face fading into clouds. But each painting had a small placard. Painted in 1971, signed in 2024. And next to them, Elena's own first painting, not perfect, not revolutionary, but unmistakably hers. She didn't sign it with Reyes. She signed it with her own name. Not to erase the past, but to begin again, honestly. The night before the exhibit opened, Elena lingered in the studio long after dark. She wasn't painting. She sat cross-legged on the worn floor, breathing in the air. Linseed oil, dust, faint citrus from the lemon tree outside the window. A knock came at the door. It was Milo, carrying a grocery bag. His sleeves were rolled, his hair slightly damp from the evening rain. "I brought bread," he said, "and oranges. I figured you forgot to eat again." She smiled without energy. "You figured right." They sat side by side in silence, sharing torn pieces of bread. The room was dim, lit only by a single desk lamp. The painting that started it all leaned against the far wall, now fully restored. Elena's brushwork layered gently over Isabel's like a conversation across decades. "She would have liked you," Milo said. Elena tilted her head. "How would you know?" "Because you didn't turn away, even when it got hard." That settled between them, soft as the rain, tapping the window pane. Later, as Milo dozed off in the armchair, Elena returned to the letter she'd found in the paint can. She'd read it a dozen times by now, but something about the way it ended still anchored her. Art lives where shame ends. Not art begins. Lives. The next morning, as the town drifted into the gallery one by one, Elena stayed to the side. She watched strangers pause, lean in, tilt their heads at brush strokes, stand back, then lean in again. They weren't rushing. Some whispered to each other. Some stood alone. When one woman began to cry quietly, Elena stepped forward without thinking. She handed her a tissue from her coat pocket. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "This just reminds me of something I can't name." "That means it's working," Elena said. By closing time, nearly 60 people had passed through the exhibit. The local paper snapped photos. An art blogger scribbled notes. But it was the girl in the yellow sweater who lingered with wide eyes the longest. "I didn't know paintings could feel like this," she said. "Do you teach?" Elena blinked. She hadn't thought of that. She hadn't thought of much beyond surviving this. But something clicked in her chest, like a clean line drawn after years of erasure. "Not yet," she said, "but maybe it's time." Later that week, Elena returned to the studio, not to paint, but to clean. The walls still bore flecks of color, the windows still wore a skin of old dust, but the room felt different now, lighter, like it could finally exhale. She moved quietly, picking up rags, folding drop cloths, rearranging frames. Each brush, each tube of pigment held weight. Not burden anymore, but meaning. She paused at the shelf where the paint can had been. The can itself was now empty, rinsed and clean, but she hadn't thrown it out. She ran her fingers over its edge, then placed it on the windowsill, like a relic, or maybe a promise. There was a knock at the open door. "Are you the owner?" asked a woman in a denim apron, holding a small wooden crate. "Kind of," Elena said, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Can I help you?" "I heard from the florist down the block that you're opening this place up again for classes or exhibits." Elena hesitated, then nodded. "That's the plan." The woman smiled and held out the crate. "These are some old brushes I was going to throw away. Thought maybe you'd know what to do with them." Elena accepted the gift, surprised by the warmth swelling in her throat. Later that day, Milo arrived with folding chairs. 2 other neighbors stopped by to ask if they could hang flyers for their community events. Someone donated a kettle and a box of tea. By sunset, the studio was no longer a sealed room of echoes. It had become porous. A girl walked in with her father and asked where the sad painting was. Elena showed her. The girl stood in front of it for a long time, then whispered something to the canvas. Elena didn't ask what. She didn't need to. That evening, she sat by the open door, sipping tea as voices rose and fell down the block. The studio, once hidden in the corners of her life, now breathed with others. She looked around at the light pooling on the floor, the soft hush of brushes settling in their jars, the painting that had started it all still resting against the wall. There were no ghosts in the room anymore, only stories, and a paint can on the window sill catching the last golden blush of day. Elena stood before her grandfather's unfinished canvas, the one she had dared to complete. It wasn't perfect. The brushstrokes weren't refined, and the perspective leaned a little too far to the left. It was honest, hers. The opening night had come softly, like a breath held and released. No red ribbons, no press, just neighbors, curious passers-by, and a few who had wandered in with stories in their pockets and nowhere else to put them. The studio pulsed with life. Laughter echoed against the rafters, chairs scraped against old tile, and a child spilled lemonade in the corner. Someone brought a violin and played a tune no one recognized, but everyone listened. And then, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and left a warm amber hush across the room, Elena stood up. She hadn't planned to speak, but her legs carried her forward to the center where the easel stood. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice steady. "This place wasn't supposed to be mine. I thought I didn't belong in it. But sometimes you don't have to be born to something. Sometimes you just have to stand still long enough for it to find you." A silence followed, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. She stepped aside and let the crowd move forward. People circled the paintings. Her painting. They didn't point or critique. They lingered quietly. A man stood with his hands in his pockets, nodding. A young woman touched her throat as if trying to catch something that had stirred. It wasn't about approval. It was about recognition. By the time the last guest left, Elena was exhausted, but whole. She looked around at the mess. Crumbs on the floor, smudges on the windows, a forgotten scarf on the chair, signs of life. She didn't clean them up. Instead, she walked to the canvas one more time. At the bottom corner, she added a final mark, not a signature, but a date. She turned off the lights, left the door unlocked, and let the truth dry on its own. The can still sat on the windowsill. It had rust around the rim now, and the paper inside had yellowed at the corners. Elena never moved it. Some days, she taught kids how to mix paint using only 3 colors. Other days, she sat beside someone who couldn't speak without shaking. Once, a man in a business suit painted a forest and cried for no reason he could explain. The studio never advertised, but it was never empty. Because in the layers we cover, the truth waits to dry. And sometimes it needs only one hand on a shoulder to begin again. Sometimes what we inherit isn't things, but questions. What would you do if you found a letter not meant for you? Tell us in the comments. We read every one.